British forces in southern Africa had clashed with the most powerful warrior nation on the continent, the Zulu. At the Battle of Isandlwana, 600 British soldiers were wiped out to a man. It took 17,000 British reinforcements, armed with the latest artillery, to defeat an enemy armed largely with spears. Back in England, a powerful voice was raised in protest.
Remember the rights of the savage, as we call him.
Gladstone was no longer in control of Parliament, so he appealed directly to the British people.
The sanctity of life in the hill villages is as inviolable in the eye of Almighty God as can be your own.
The power of his oratory drew vast crowds. 10,000 Zulus had died, he claimed.
For no other offense than to defend against your artillery with their naked bodies, their hearths, their homes, their wives, their families.
I mean, it is one of the great mysteries about Gladstone, how his oratory was so effective. Because he wasn't a tremendous phrase maker, and he didn't talk down to his audience, and he rather talked up to them, and yet he held them for these very long periods. An hour and a half was quite normal in great mass meetings. I think it was essentially his physical presence, the sort of flash of his eagle's eye, the drama of his gestures, the cadence of his voice. I was fascinated when an old man came up to me and said, "My father used to be a shouter for Gladstone." It was absolutely precise, meaning he was employed at a Gladstone meeting, together with a number of other people, to stand about 20 to 30 yards back from the platform and to turn round and attempt to relay Gladstone to the more distant audience. He's going on to Bulgarian atrocities now. And it does seem to be absolute proof that a lot of the fringes, or even wide fringes of the meeting, could not actually hear what Gladstone was saying. But the fact that he could hold a mass audience standing for an hour and a half when they couldn't really hear what he was saying is the most tremendous tribute I can think of to the sheer force of his physical presence.
The Queen was outraged. She complained in her journal,
"Mr. Gladstone is going about like an American stumping orator, making most violent speeches."
But to her surprise and dismay, Gladstone had struck a popular chord. Once more, he had appealed to the British sense of justice and fair play. They voted the Liberals back into power with a massive majority. Gladstone wrote exultantly of the defeat of Disraeli and the showy imperialism he represented.
It is like the vanishing of some magnificent castle in an Italian romance.
Prince Albert would have shared Gladstone's pleasure at the dismissal of Disraeli's warmongering government. But Victoria had turned her back on Albert's moral vision for the empire. She stubbornly refused to accept Gladstone as her new prime minister. She wrote to her private secretary,
"The Queen will sooner abdicate than send for or have any communication with that half-mad firebrand, who would soon ruin everything and be a dictator. Others but herself may submit to his democratic rule, but not the Queen."
But she was a constitutional monarch, and submit she must. Gladstone returned to power, determined to reverse Disraeli's imperialist policies. He set out to achieve home rule for Ireland. He pressed for the appointment of more Indian judges and ensured that Englishmen could no longer refuse to appear before them. But in Africa, Gladstone could do little to halt the public hunger for conquest, a hunger nourished by the further adventures of David Livingstone. Livingstone had returned to Africa to search for the source of the River Nile. For 5 years he disappeared without a trace, and his obituary even appeared in the press.
There's no doubt that travelling in Africa had gone into his blood. But it was also, I think, he felt that if he succeeded in this, he would gain credibility again. He would show himself as a person who'd explored and found the source of the Nile. And that would give credence to his views on slavery and the development of Africa through Christianity and commerce. But he was, at this time, more and more affected by illness. He was losing blood. He would have attacks of malaria and dysentery. He had hemorrhoids, and he was a very, very sick man.
A journalist, Henry Morton Stanley, was sent to Africa by an American newspaper with orders to find the lost missionary. Stanley fought his way through warring tribes, spurred on by reported sightings of Livingstone. After 7 months, he finally reached the remote trading post deep in the interior. And here, in November 1871, the famous meeting took place.
Dr. Livingstone, I presume.
Whether or not the immortal words were fact or fiction, Stanley had found his man. The news was telegraphed around the world. But when the headlines had faded, Livingstone was still in Africa, alone, desperately lonely and increasingly unwell. Close to death, he wrote a final letter beseeching the world to abolish the slave trade.
All I can add in my loneliness is may heaven's rich blessing come down on everyone, American, English, or Turk, who will help to heal the open sore of the world.
On the night of April 30th, 1873, David Livingstone died. His body was wrapped in a shroud of tree bark and calico for its long journey back to England. But first, Livingstone's servants cut his heart out and buried it under a tree, so that it would always remain in Africa. When the body finally arrived in Britain, the Queen declared a day of national mourning. Livingstone was buried in Westminster Abbey, and the words of his final letter were engraved on his tomb. But Livingstone's African adventures had an effect he would never have endorsed. Africa, the dark continent of the early explorers, became the stage for the final act in the story of Queen Victoria's empire. In the footsteps of missionaries like David Livingstone, the powers of Europe conducted a brutal race for colonies. In Britain, this last burst of expansion was inspired by two men whose stories would bring the British people to a climax of imperialistic fervor. The first, General Charles Gordon. Sent on a diplomatic mission to a poor Arab country, he launched a personal crusade to free an oppressed people. His defiant stand would draw his queen and her empire into a holy war and lead them on a romantic but violent quest to impose a new world order. The second, Cecil John Rhodes, started out as a simple cotton farmer. and he became the greatest empire builder of his generation. To fund his dreams of conquest, he embarked on a ruthless pursuit of diamonds, gold, and power that made him the most formidable and the most hated man in Africa. Between them, Cecil Rhodes and Charles Gordon exemplified the virtues and the vices of their age. They would lead the British to new heights of glory, and they would expose the dark underside of Victoria's empire. At the age of 60, Queen Victoria still wore the black satin and lace she had donned in mourning for her beloved husband, Prince Albert, who had died 20 years before. To her 350 million subjects across the world, she was the godlike symbol of British power and prestige. But in the winter of 1884, her empire faced a serious threat from one of the poorest and most obscure regions on Earth, the Sudan. There is this saying among the Arabs, when Allah made the Sudan, he laughed. In Queen Victoria's time, most of its 9 million people were nomads roaming a wilderness as large as Western Europe. The Sudan had no roads, no railways, and most of it was unmapped. Out of this wilderness came a prophet, an Islamic preacher who became known to the Arabs and then to the world as the Mahdi, the expected one. The Mahdi inspired the warlike tribes of the Sudan to rise up against their corrupt rulers. His armies swept through the country like the Simoom itself, the notorious wind of the desert. Many in England soon feared that a jihad, or holy war, would sweep northward into Egypt and threaten the lifeline of the British Empire, the Suez Canal. 3/4 of the ships using the canal were British, and it formed a vital link to Victoria's richest possessions in India and the East. For this reason, British troops were stationed in Egypt to protect it. Now the Queen urged her Prime Minister, Gladstone, to use those troops against the Mahdi.
The Queen feels very strongly about the Sudan and Egypt, and she must say she thinks a blow must be struck. These are wild Arabs, and they would not stand against regular troops at all. We must make a demonstration of strength.
Gladstone did his level best to treat the Queen with courtesy, but he did not place great value on her judgment.
Quite worthless.
Gladstone's an extraordinary statesman. As a young man, he is a Tory, very right-wing views. As an old man, he has very left-wing and radical views. As most people get more conservative as they get older, he makes the reverse journey. But the most important thing in Gladstone's life is that whenever he has any problem, any political problem, he speaks to God. He asks for God's guidance.
Gladstone was a champion of human rights, and he believed in opposing tyranny. He was against the use of British troops to suppress what he saw as a popular uprising in the Sudan. But the press and public were of the Queen's opinion. They wanted action. Gladstone's government decided to play for time. They proposed sending a top army officer to the Sudan to report on the situation. For this mission, they chose one of the most popular heroes of the Victorian age, General Charles George Gordon. British forces in southern Africa had clashed with the most powerful warrior nation on the continent, the Zulu. At the Battle of Isandlwana, 600
Another offense than to defend against your artillery with their naked bodies, their
mean, it is one of the great mysteries about Gladstone. How is
British soldiers were wiped out to a man. It took 17,000 British reinforcements, armed with the latest artillery, to defeat an enemy armed largely with spears. Back in England,
is as inviolable in the eye of Almighty God as can be your own.
the power of his oratory drew vast crowds. 10,000 Zulus had died, he claimed.
For no
A powerful voice was raised in protest.
remember the rights of the savage, as we call him.
Gladstone was no
Remember
longer in control of Parliament, so he appealed directly to the British people.
the sanctity of life in the hill villages.